Very pleased to be here with Betsy from Uber, who has an amazing background, not just at Uber, but also at Google, at McKinsey. She was a Rhodes Scholar, so certainly has quite a bit to talk with us about. And I think Uber is probably the startup that needs no introduction. Pretty much everyone knows what your company is and what it does. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your role is there and how it deals with policy.
Sure. So I've been at Uber for about a year and a half, and I head up our global public policy and economics team. And so my team supports Uber's operations around the world, advancing for modern ride-sharing regulations that will actually facilitate the growth of our business.
Great. And so one of the things, so the topic of this discussion is, will entrepreneurship and policy ever get in sync? And there's a lot of discussion, both in Europe and in Silicon Valley, on different frameworks and regulatory, ecosystems that might impact what that looks like. In your experience, what are some of the differences between entrepreneurship here and entrepreneurship in Europe?
Yeah. So I think the first comment that I would make, and I recognize I'm speaking to a bunch of technology and sort of entrepreneurs who are focused on high-tech, fast-growth industries, but the first observation that I think I would make is, over the last 15 years, we've gotten really focused on entrepreneurship as a technology-driven concept. And we think about the Larry Pages and the Travis Kalanick's and the Mark Zuckerbergs as the great entrepreneurs. But there's an entire range of people out there who have the ability to be entrepreneurs in a very small business-oriented way. And I think one thing that is sort of top of mind for us is, how do you help individuals get going, either in their own independent work or as an entrepreneur in a much smaller capacity. So for us, people who are driving with the Uber platform are entrepreneurs in our mind, and we think a lot about how to facilitate policy environments that make it easy for them to get started. And it turns out that's actually pretty hard in huge swaths of the world, certainly in Europe. And then I guess the second point I would make is, I think there's, to some extent, an important adaptiveness that you need to see in a policy framework if you actually want to facilitate entrepreneurship and innovation generally. And that is, the policies need to be able to adapt to the current environment that you're living in today. One of my favorite examples is back in the early 1900s in London. It was actually written in the Hackney, the sort of taxi cab regulations at the time, that the cab had to be tall enough for the gentleman in the back to wear a top hat that was 6 inches high. And of course, the world moved on, and gentlemen stopped wearing top hats as a sort of matter of course day to day, and the regulations adapted. And I think there's a similar adaptiveness that you need to see in regulations across the board. I think it was Marco who was talking earlier about this next phase of the internet sort of making its way into traditional industries. And as that happens, it becomes more and more important to rethink from very first principles, what is this regulation solving for? What is the fundamental purpose that it's trying to serve? And is it still working in today's technology-centric era?
So you said what's next for this era of internet and what that means for innovation, and you also said we see drivers as entrepreneurs, so I feel like I have to ask you about self-driving cars and what that's going to mean for all of your drivers, because it's predicted that Uber will control up to 25% of all miles driven by 2030. So how many of those are going to be drivers, and what would you say to a policymaker who says, you can't tell me that you're giving people jobs if you're going to take them away?
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I love the prediction. I hadn't heard that yet. It gives me some comfort. But I think there's a couple points. So the first one is, we've announced that we're about to put self-driving cars on the road in Pittsburgh, that's something we're actively moving towards. But we've also described this in our vision for how this will roll out as a very incremental thing. It's going to take years, and the cars that we'll have on the road in the near future won't be fully self-driving on their own, but they're also going to be a very small portion of our fleet for quite a long time. And so what that means is, you've got a lot of people who today need work. And this is solving a very real problem for those people today in the here and now. And those problems could be anything from, I'm in between jobs and I actually need full income to supplant this period of time when I don't have work, to I'm saving up for a vacation and I just want to earn some money part-time. But I think in our view, this is the future in which there are no drivers anymore is quite a long ways off. And so we're not actually as worried about that as it might seem.
So yes, the self-driving car thing is a ways off, but taxi drivers are arguing, and you've seen a lot with some of the cities you're dealing with, have been able to push back and say, actually, you can't operate in this city at all. And can you talk about what that might have been like to deal with, say, when it first happened in Las Vegas and how you navigated that versus what it's been like for you in a city like Barcelona, where you're still not operating?
Yep. So I think we face this issue in cities and countries around the world where you've got these regulations that are now 50 or 60 years old and arguably are serving incumbents more than they are serving the original purpose that they were designed to serve. I think a lot of the conversation we have today with policymakers is let's go back to first principles. Everyone can agree you need to solve for consumer protection concerns. You need to ensure that there are some baseline regulations in place to make sure the trip's going to be safe. You need to ensure that there's a competitive market and that people have an opportunity to compete in the market. I think years and years ago, before I was at Uber, so I can't really speak about Las Vegas necessarily, but we certainly had very much a Silicon Valley approach to these problems, which is let's go in and try this and see what happens. And it didn't necessarily work as well for us in some parts of the world as it did in others, and the obvious examples are in Europe. And so, I think we have stated that in Spain, we maybe didn't go about it quite the right way. We are now launched in Madrid, and we are launched as a fully licensed product, which actually is the nature of most of our business in Europe, is these drivers are effectively they're licensed under the existing regs from 20 years ago. So they are doing 250 hours of training in the case of France that is required before they can even get started. In some of these countries, there's a capital requirement where the driver has to prove that they have several $1,000s in a bank account before they can start driving. And most of our business in Europe looks like that. Here in the US, it doesn't. A driver can actually sign up on the app. They can upload documentation, such as their driver's license, their proof of insurance, the fact that they've gone to a vehicle safety inspection and had their car inspected. And within a number of days, they can be driving on the platform. And the difference between those two businesses is meaningful, not just in terms of what Uber is doing for the cities, because if you look at LA or New York, we're serving the outer boroughs now at a very similar scale as what we serve Manhattan. So we're actually facilitating transportation where it didn't exist anymore in transportation deserts. But also for the drivers. So a driver who's getting going in Europe, if you're looking at 250 hours of training, the only way that you're going to do that is if you're going to do this job full-time for years so that you're actually going to make up the return on that original investment that you've put into things. And that means that you see a very different type of driver population. It's still facilitating work opportunities for people who didn't have it. Something like 10 or 12% of our drivers in France were unemployed for over a year before they started driving with Uber. But it's not opening up opportunities for independent workers who might just need a part-time option or who might need something for a very limited period of time, students during the summer months, for example. And that type of opportunity is what we see here in the US that isn't available to us in Europe in the same way.
And do you think that's a direct result of the regulatory framework in each respective region? Do you think there's a cultural background to understanding the nature of work in each place?
I think it is much more so a direct result of the regulation than it is anything else. I mean, you look at the costs to get going; they're so high that you're not gonna get started. Whereas you or I might decide, I'm gonna drive for Uber this month while I'm in between jobs and just do it for 5 or 6 hours a week. 50%, more than 50% of our drivers in the U.S. are driving for under 10 hours a week. And so these are people who are literally just doing it to make some extra money on the side, for whatever reason, for vacation, for some sort of special event, any kind of different reason they might be doing it. My favorites are actually the folks who have retired from their careers, and they do this. I've had a couple drivers who do this in the mornings every day for 3 or 4 hours. They don't do it very long, but it's something that gets them out of bed in the morning. It gives them regularity in their routine, which is encouraging.
Yeah, I think I've had a lot of Uber drivers that are artists and will tell me about what they're working on, and I think that's wonderful. It's a great part of it, but you're right, there's definitely a lot of challenges. So if you could have one wish from Brussels that you could have granted overnight, what would it be?
I think at a very high level, continuing to push on the sharing economy strategy that the Commission already has been working towards, and continuing to push on the single market strategy. Because I think if those two things continue moving forward, we'll see regulatory environments that facilitate independent work in a much more productive way than we see today. Simple things like, it's very hard today to file your taxes as an independent worker. That's true in the US, it's true in Europe. And there are things that we could do in both DC and Brussels to make that easier for people, to facilitate filing of income taxes in a way that's much easier.
And do you think Uber, since there's Uber Eats, there's Uber Delivery, is it a transportation provider or is it a technology platform?
Our mission is to make transportation as reliable as running water everywhere for everyone. And so it's a little bit hard to say that we aren't in the transportation business, and I'd be disingenuous to suggest that. We are also, though, a technology company. And I think the value that we provide over and above the existing transportation options is because of the technology. So if you think about safety protections, when you get in a cab today, the existing safety protections on you are that you can look up the license number for that cab. You typically will see a card that has the cab driver's name and maybe an identification number for him, so that if something happens, you can follow up after the fact. But if you get into a cab, nobody knows you've gotten into that cab, nobody knows where that cab's gone. I experienced this a lot as a single woman traveling. It's kind of, you get into a cab, no one knows where you are. And what Uber has facilitated is this way that technology can actually create a safer environment for people. When you get into an Uber car, you're being tracked. It's sort of a scary word in some ways, but somebody knows where you are. If something happens to you, if you don't get home, if you don't get where you were intended to go, there's a GPS record of where your phone went. There are reputation systems so that you see before the car arrives which car is showing up and who the driver is, what his or her name is. So you get into the car. Every time I get into a car, I say, hi, I'm Betsy. And I expect the driver to say back to me what his name is. And I've checked the license plate before I get in. I know that this driver is the one who's there to match me up. Those things are only possible because of our technology. And so we are, in some sense, both. And I think one of the challenges you have in many places is the regulations attempt to push us into one category or the other. And in fact, we're sort of in the middle.
So you're both.
Yeah. Short answer, if I had to answer
the question. Yeah. So, and again, the panel, just coming back to what we're focusing on is entrepreneurship. Is policy ever going to catch up? What do you think needs to happen, and we'll wrap up after this, to really allow government to get on the same page as entrepreneurs and as fast, rapid-growing startups like Uber?
Yeah, I think at a high level, it's this adaptiveness, the ability to rapidly pivot and switch course and go back to first principles and think about, is what we have in front of us actually solving the original purpose? And if it's not, to have the courage to actually poke that open and try to go back and redesign it.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.